Welcome to Crimson Threads, where we unravel the darkest knots of human nature. In today's story, we delve into a case that shattered the idyllic facade of a small town. A case of love, betrayal, and a chilling decision that led to a brutal end. A husband, a wife, and a mistressa classic triangle, but with a horrifying twist. What happens when the sacred vows of marriage are not just broken, but obliterated by a sinister choice? Join us as we uncover the story of a wife slain and discarded, and the long, arduous path to a justice that almost seemed lost. Before we descend into the shadows of this harrowing tale, if you're a fan of true crime and compelling storytelling, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single thread of our investigations. Now let us begin. The salt-laced air of West Haven, a quaint coastal town where a salty tang perpetually clung to the air, was the backdrop for what many considered a picture-perfect life. It was a town of picket fences and freshly mown lawns, of community bake sales and 4th of July parades. And at the heart of this idyllic setting lived Eleanor and Richard Blackwood, in a sprawling Victorian house with a wraparound porch and a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of success and happiness. Richard was a man of considerable charm and ambition. His chiseled jawline and piercing blue eyes had a way of commanding attention, and his success as a real estate developer had only amplified his natural charisma. He was the man who could sell a dream, and he had sold the dream of a perfect life to Eleanor. She, with her gentle demeanor and a smile that could light up a room, was the perfect complement to his drive. She was the artist, her delicate watercolors capturing the serene beauty of the West Haven coastline, her canvases often displayed in the local gallery. Their love story was the stuff of local legend. They had met in college, a whirlwind romance that had culminated in a fairy tale wedding. He was the ambitious business major and she the ethereal art student. They were yin and yang, a perfect balance of ambition and creativity. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who were now away at boarding school, their laughter echoing only in the memories that filled the grand, silent rooms of their home. But beneath the gleaming surface of their lives, a rot had begun to set in. The laughter that once filled their home had become a hollow echo. The shared glances that once spoke volumes were now filled with an unspoken tension. Richard's business trips had become more frequent, his absences longer. When he was home, he was distant, his mind seemingly a million miles away. He would spend hours on his phone, a secretive smile playing on his lips as he texted, a smile that was no longer meant for Eleanor. Eleanor, ever perceptive, had noticed the shift. The scent of an unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, the late-night calls he would take in hushed tones in his study, the growing emotional chasm between them. She had tried to talk to him, to bridge the ever-widening gap, but her attempts were met with a dismissive wave of his hand and a curt, "You're imagining things, Ellie. I'm just stressed with work." The work had a name: Isabella. She was everything Eleanor was not. Isabella was a fiery, ambitious woman who worked as Richard's associate. She was sharp, witty, and unapologetically confident. She moved through the world with a self-assurance that Eleanor, in her quiet grace, had never possessed. And she had set her sights on Richard from the moment they met. Their affair had started as a spark, a shared glance across a boardroom table, a lingering touch of hands over a business proposal. It had quickly ignited into a raging fire, a passionate, all-consuming affair that made Richard feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. With Isabella, he was not just a husband and a father. He was a man desired, a man admired for his power and his ambition. She didn't want the quiet life of bake sales and art galleries. She wanted the world, and she wanted it with him. The deception was a carefully constructed web. Richard had become a master of lies, his alibis seamless, his stories convincing. He would speak of late-night meetings and early morning flights, of demanding clients and high-stakes negotiations. And Eleanor, wanting to believe in the man she had loved for so long, had clung to his words, even as the cold knot of suspicion tightened in her gut. The cracks in their gilded cage began to show in subtle ways. A forgotten anniversary, a birthday gift that felt impersonal and rushed, a dismissiveness towards her art, which had once been a source of his pride. He would belittle her passions, calling them hobbies, a gentle word that carried the weight of his disdain. He was slowly, methodically, chipping away at her self-worth, making her feel small, insignificant. One rainy afternoon, Eleanor stumbled upon the first piece of concrete evidence. Richard had left his laptop open on his desk, a rare oversight. An email was open on the screen, an email from Isabella. The words were a dagger to Eleanor's heart, a confirmation of her deepest fears. It was not a business email. It was a love letter, filled with passionate declarations and intimate details of their stolen moments together. The world that Eleanor had so carefully constructed around herself shattered into a million pieces. The confrontation was inevitable. That evening, as the rain lashed against the windows of their perfect home, Eleanor presented Richard with the printed email. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. For a moment, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or even fear, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. He didn't deny it. The time for lies was over. He admitted to the affair, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he were discussing a business transaction. He spoke of Isabella with a reverence that he had not used for Eleanor in years. He spoke of a future with her, a future that did not include Eleanor. The days that followed were a blur of pain and betrayal. Eleanor was a ghost in her own home, her heart a gaping wound. The man she had built her life with was a stranger, a cruel, heartless man who had discarded her for a newer, shinier model. She had given him everything: her love, her youth, her dreams, and in return, he had given her a shattered heart and a future that was now a terrifying, empty void. The town, with its prying eyes and wagging tongues, soon began to notice the chill that had descended upon the Blackwood home. The perfect couple was no longer seen taking their evening strolls, hand in hand. The laughter that had once spilled out from their open windows was replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Eleanor, in her despair, had confided in her closest friend, a woman named Clara. Clara, a fiercely loyal and protective friend, had urged her to leave him, to take him for everything he was worth. But Eleanor was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The thought of dismantling the life she had so carefully built, of admitting to the world that her perfect marriage was a lie, was a humiliation she could not bear. Richard, meanwhile, was growing impatient. Isabella was pressuring him to leave Eleanor, to start their new life together. She was a woman who was used to getting what she wanted, and she wanted Richard. The divorce, however, was proving to be a messy, complicated affair. Eleanor, though heartbroken, was not a fool. She had hired a lawyer, a shrewd, no-nonsense woman who was determined to protect her client's interests. The financial implications of the divorce were a blow to Richard's ego and his carefully curated image of success. Eleanor was entitled to half of everything, a fortune that he had no intention of sharing. His dream of a new life with Isabella was being threatened by the woman he now saw as an obstacle, a roadblock to his happiness. The tension in the Blackwood home had reached a breaking point. The once loving whispers had been replaced by heated arguments, their voices laced with venom and resentment. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a battleground. One evening, after a particularly vicious argument about the divorce settlement, Eleanor had retreated to her art studio, a small, sunlit room at the back of the house that had always been her sanctuary. She had sought solace in her art, her paintbrush dancing across the canvas, a whirlwind of color and emotion. Richard had found her there, his face a mask of cold fury. He had stood in the doorway, his presence a dark cloud in her sunlit haven. The words that had passed between them that night were a toxic cocktail of accusations and threats. He had called her a gold digger, a parasite who was trying to ruin him. She, in turn, had called him a liar and a cheat, a man who had no heart, no soul. The argument had escalated, their voices rising to a fever pitch. And then, in a moment of chilling clarity, Eleanor had looked into his eyes, his cold, blue eyes, and she had seen something she had never seen before. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. And in that moment, a terrifying premonition had washed over her. This man, the man she had once loved with all her heart, was capable of anything. As she lay in bed that night, the house silent around her, a sense of dread had settled deep in her bones. The gilded cage had become a prison, and she was trapped with a man who no longer saw her as his wife, but as an obstacle to be removed. The salty air of West Haven, which had once felt like a comforting embrace, now felt heavy, suffocating, and the rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore sounded like a mournful dirge, a harbinger of the tragedy that was to come. The idyllic facade of their perfect life had crumbled, revealing the ugly, terrifying truth that lay beneath. And in the heart of this picture-perfect town, a storm was brewing, a storm that would end in a brutal, unspeakable act of violence. The choice had been made. The husband had chosen his mistress, and the wife, in the cold, dark waters of Eel Pond, was about to pay the ultimate price for his betrayal. The morning of Eleanor's disappearance dawned with an unsettling calm. The sky over West Haven was a canvas of muted grays, the air thick with an unspoken premonition. Richard Blackwood was the first to raise the alarm. He called the local police department, his voice a carefully calibrated mix of concern and panic. He told them his wife was gone. She hadn't come home the previous night. Her car was still in the driveway, her purse and phone on the kitchen counter. The police, initially treating it as a standard missing person case, arrived at the Blackwood residence to a scene of domestic tranquility. The house was immaculate, not a single thing out of place. Richard, playing the part of the distraught husband, recounted a story of a minor argument the night before. He said Eleanor had gone for a walk to clear her head, a common occurrence for her when she was upset. He had fallen asleep on the couch, he claimed, and had woken up in the middle of the night to find her still gone. The lead detective on the case, a seasoned officer named Frank Miller, was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was telling him that something was amiss. Richard's story, while plausible, felt rehearsed. His grief seemed performative, his eyes lacking the genuine terror of a man whose wife had vanished into thin air. The initial search for Eleanor was extensive. Volunteers from the community, friends, and neighbors combed the beaches, the wooded areas, and the winding coastal paths that Eleanor had loved to walk. Her face, her gentle smile, was plastered on posters all over town, a haunting reminder of the woman who had disappeared from their midst. As the days turned into a week, the initial hope that had buoyed the community began to wane. The search parties grew smaller, the hushed whispers of concern turning into morbid speculation. And all the while, Richard Blackwood maintained his public facade of the grieving husband, giving tearful interviews to the local news, pleading for his wife's safe return. But behind the closed doors of the investigation, a different picture was beginning to emerge. Detective Miller and his team had started digging into the Blackwoods' seemingly perfect life, and what they found was a tangled web of deceit and betrayal. Financial records revealed a marriage on the brink of a very expensive divorce. Friends of Eleanor, initially hesitant to speak ill of the grieving husband, began to open up, their stories painting a portrait of a marriage that was anything but perfect. Clara, Eleanor's closest friend, was the first to break the dam of silence. She told the detectives about the affair, about Richard's cruelty, about Eleanor's growing fear of her husband. She recounted the heated arguments, the threats, the look of pure hatred that Eleanor had seen in his eyes. Her testimony was a chilling counter-narrative to the one Richard was so carefully constructing for the public. The detectives then turned their attention to the other woman, Isabella. When they brought her in for questioning, she was a picture of cool, collected confidence. She admitted to the affair, her tone unapologetic. She spoke of her love for Richard, of their plans for a future together, a future that was contingent on Eleanor being out of the picture. She had an alibi for the night of Eleanor's disappearance, a business dinner with colleagues, an alibi that was quickly confirmed. But her demeanor, her lack of empathy for the missing woman, raised more than a few red flags. The investigation into Richard's alibi, however, was where the cracks in his story began to widen. He had claimed to be at home, asleep on the couch. But a neighbor's security camera, positioned just across the street from the Blackwood residence, told a different story. The footage showed Richard's car leaving the driveway late on the night of Eleanor's disappearance, returning several hours later. When confronted with this evidence, Richard's calm demeanor finally shattered. He stumbled over his words, his explanations flimsy and unconvincing. He claimed he had gone for a drive to clear his head, a late-night cruise along the coast. But the timeline didn't add up, the hours of his absence unaccounted for. The detectives, now convinced that Richard was lying, obtained a warrant to search the Blackwood home and Richard's car. The house, on the surface, was spotless. Too spotless. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase any trace of a struggle. But a forensic team, with their keen eyes and specialized equipment, found what they were looking for. In the trunk of Richard's car, hidden beneath the spare tire, they found a small, dark stain. It was almost invisible to the naked eye, but under a luminol spray, it glowed with an eerie blue light. It was blood. The lab results confirmed their worst fears. The blood in the trunk of Richard's car was a perfect match for Eleanor. The noose was tightening around Richard Blackwood's neck. The distraught husband was now the prime suspect. The news of the blood evidence sent shockwaves through West Haven. The community that had once rallied around Richard now looked at him with suspicion and contempt. The whispers of speculation had turned into open accusations. The man they had once admired was now a monster in their midst. Richard, sensing the shifting tides, had hired a high-powered defense attorney, a man known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to create reasonable doubt where there was none. The narrative of the grieving husband was quickly replaced by the narrative of the wrongfully accused, a man being persecuted by a police department desperate to close a high-profile case. But the evidence against him continued to mount. A search of his computer records revealed a disturbing search history. In the weeks leading up to Eleanor's disappearance, he had searched for terms like how to dispose of a body, eel pond depths, and how to get away with murder. It was a digital breadcrumb trail that led directly to his dark intentions. The detectives also uncovered a financial motive that was as compelling as the affair. Richard's real estate business, which had appeared to be thriving, was actually on the verge of collapse. He was in deep debt, and the divorce settlement would have been the final nail in his financial coffin. With Eleanor out of the picture, he stood to inherit her considerable life insurance policy, a sum that would not only solve his financial problems but would also pave the way for his new life with Isabella. The serene, idyllic town of West Haven had become the backdrop for a real-life noir film. The salty air was thick with suspense, the crashing waves a constant reminder of the secrets that the ocean held. The vanishing of Eleanor Blackwood had ripped away the town's quaint facade, revealing the darkness that could fester even in the most picturesque of settings. And then a breakthrough. A local fisherman, casting his line in the murky waters of Eel Pond, a secluded, brackish body of water on the outskirts of town, had snagged something heavy. It wasn't a fish. It was a woman's body, the body of Eleanor Blackwood. The vanishing tides had finally given up their tragic secret. The search was over, and the hunt for justice was about to begin. The idyllic life of West Haven had been irrevocably shattered, its innocence lost to the cold, dark waters of a pond that now held the secrets of a husband's ultimate betrayal. The discovery of Eleanor's body in Eel Pond was a grim turning point in the case. The community of West Haven, which had held onto a sliver of hope for her safe return, was now plunged into a collective state of mourning and rage. The abstract tragedy of a missing person had become a stark, horrifying reality. The woman they had known, the artist with the gentle smile, had been stolen from them in the most brutal way imaginable. The autopsy report painted a chilling picture of Eleanor's final moments. She had died from blunt force trauma to the head, a single devastating blow. The medical examiner also found traces of a sedative in her system, suggesting that she had been drugged before she was killed. This was not a crime of passion, a spontaneous act of violence. This was a cold, calculated murder. With the discovery of the body and the mounting evidence against him, Richard Blackwood was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. The man who had once been a pillar of the community was now a pariah, his face gracing the front page of every local newspaper, his eyes cold and defiant even in the unflattering light of a mugshot. The trial of Richard Blackwood was the biggest media event in West Haven's history. The small-town courthouse was besieged by news vans and reporters, all eager to cover the salacious details of the case. The trial was a spectacle, a real-life soap opera playing out in a courtroom. The prosecution, led by a sharp, tenacious district attorney, laid out their case with methodical precision. They presented the jury with the mountain of evidence they had collected. The blood in the trunk of Richard's car, the incriminating internet searches, the testimony of Eleanor's friends, the financial motive, and the affair with Isabella. Isabella, once the confident, unapologetic mistress, was a far more subdued figure on the witness stand. The harsh glare of the courtroom lights seemed to have stripped away her bravado. She recounted the details of her affair with Richard, her voice barely a whisper. She admitted that he had spoken of his desire to be free of Eleanor, that he had complained about the financial burden of a divorce. Her testimony, though not a direct confession of his guilt, painted a damning portrait of a man who saw his wife as an obstacle to his own happiness. But the most compelling testimony came from Clara, Eleanor's loyal friend. She spoke of Eleanor's fear, of her premonition that Richard was capable of hurting her. She read from Eleanor's journal, her voice cracking with emotion as she shared her friend's final, terrified thoughts. The courtroom was silent, the jury visibly moved by her words. Richard's defense attorney, true to his reputation, fought back with a ferocity that was both impressive and unsettling. He attacked the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, painting Clara as a scorned friend with a vendetta against Richard. He tried to portray Isabella as a woman who had been manipulated by the police into turning against the man she loved. He argued that the internet searches were taken out of context, the product of an idle, morbid curiosity. He even tried to suggest that the blood in the trunk of Richard's car was the result of a nosebleed, a desperate, far-fetched explanation that was met with audible scoffs from the gallery. Richard himself took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that ultimately proved to be his undoing. He was calm, articulate, and convincingly emotional as he spoke of his love for Eleanor, his grief over her death. He admitted to the affair, casting himself as a flawed man who had made a terrible mistake, but not a murderer. He stuck to his story of the late-night drive, his alibi for the night of the murder. But under the relentless cross-examination of the district attorney, his carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The prosecutor hammered away at the inconsistencies in his story, the lies he had told the police, the damning evidence that pointed directly to his guilt. Richard's composure began to fray, his answers becoming evasive, his tone defensive. And then, the prosecutor presented the jury with the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. It was a piece of a torn, muddy piece of fabric that had been found near the spot where Eleanor's body had been discovered. It was a small, seemingly insignificant scrap of cloth. But when the forensic experts matched it to the torn lining of the trunk of Richard's car, it became the thread that unraveled his entire web of lies. It was the physical proof that his car had been at the scene of the crime. The jury's deliberation was surprisingly swift. After just a few hours, they returned with a verdict. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Richard Blackwood stood before the judge, his face pale, his hands trembling. The foreman of the jury, a stern-faced man with tired eyes, delivered the verdict. Guilty. Guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife, Eleanor Blackwood. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by sobs of relief from Eleanor's friends and family. Richard Blackwood, the man who had thought he could get away with murder, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that would ensure that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, a prisoner of his own making. The story of Eleanor and Richard Blackwood became a cautionary tale in West Haven, a dark chapter in the town's history. The beautiful Victorian house on the hill was sold, its wraparound porch and manicured gardens a silent testament to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The memory of Eleanor, however, lived on. Her art, once relegated to the local gallery, was now celebrated, her delicate watercolors a poignant reminder of the beauty and grace that had been so senselessly extinguished. A scholarship fund was established in her name, a fund to support young, aspiring artists, a legacy of creativity and hope born from the ashes of a terrible tragedy. The salty air of West Haven still carried the scent of the ocean. The waves still crashed against the shore in a rhythmic, timeless cadence. But for those who remembered the story of the slain wife and the husband who had chosen his mistress, the idyllic facade of their town had been forever shattered. They had learned a hard lesson, a lesson about the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most perfect of surfaces, a lesson about the devastating consequences of a choice born from betrayal and greed. Justice, in the end, had been served, but the scars of that brutal, unforgettable crime would forever remain, a permanent stain on the picturesque landscape of a town that had lost its innocence to the cold, dark waters of Eel Pond.